Friends, today's NRI Samay program from Los Angeles brought to you commercial free by listeners like you. Your generous donations make possible for us to stay commercial free, and today's show is pre-recorded. If you have a question for the guest, please send an email to nrisamay@gmail.com. We will follow up with the guest and find the answer for you. Thank you for your support.
You mentioned hunger, and I think that's one of the cases for GMO food is that they're highly productive, and it is very important to feed the ever-increasing billions of population on Earth. Mm-hmm. And there are people providing counter-arguments. Can you provide some commentary on that? Is GMO food really productive, and is that a solution to feed the billions of population? If not, then why?
Well, yes and no. The Green Revolution has certainly, as a whole, fed many more people, millions or billions more people than anyone would have believed possible, 250 years ago. So, and to some extent, genetic modification is simply, one facet of the Green Revolution. It's one facet of using technology to expand our ability to produce food and produce it in a smaller area. So in that sort of general sense, yes, I think it does help. But in a more specific sense, it's a much the analysis is a lot more complicated than that because a lot of hunger occurs because of inadequate distribution of food rather than inadequate production of food. We produce enough grain to feed the world now. We just don't distribute it effectively. There are many, many barriers to having that distributed effectively to the people who need it the most. So even though we are producing adequate food in the world right now, we still have hunger in the world. So simply producing more feed corn in the Midwestern United States, to feed to cattle is not necessarily going to reduce hunger in sub-Saharan Africa.
Right. And the corollary to that is, for example, the BT cotton from Monsanto, etc., in India has raised quite a furor because, in contrary to what the claims have been, that they are not more productive than the native seeds, and they need more capital costs as well as other capital input in terms of using fertilizers and be productive. So that seems to be a challenge. And is it a challenge only to small-scale farmers, or is it true with large acreage farmers in the U.S.?
I think it depends a lot. I think from what I've read, particularly about the BT cotton in India, the challenge is particularly acute for smaller scale farmers. The studies that I have seen suggest that for larger farmers, and particularly farmers that are relying on irrigation, these products may improve yields and may in fact be beneficial. But for smaller farmers and for those who cannot afford as many capital inputs, for those that are not able to irrigate large areas, they may be detrimental. In India, that may actually be certainly a larger number of farmers, if not necessarily a larger amount of production. I'm not sure how it plays out in terms of the amount of production. So certainly there is reason to have concern for smaller farmers. And for farmers themselves who might be considering adopting these products, I think there's reason to think about their operations very carefully and to really compare their operations with those that have had success and those that have not, because it's not appropriate. It's not helpful for every farmer. It's helpful for some farmers. It's not helpful for all of them. And in this country, It tends to be larger farmers that adopt these products, but even those farmers can also run into difficulty at times. One of the difficulties for grain farmers in the Midwestern United States is the difficulty of finding productive seeds, alternative seeds to plant, and the difficulty of preserving the integrity of those seeds if they do want to plant non-GMO seed. So there has been a lot of litigation over those questions. So it may be difficult, for example, for a farmer who starts down the road of growing GMO seed, intentionally or even unintentionally in some cases, to then be able to sort of backpedal and say, okay, this isn't working for me, I'm going to change over and grow something else because there may be contamination issues.
Right. That's what I was referring to. So in India especially, there is this argument that traditional seed sources are being killed around the world by push from these GMO seeds. Are there going to be repercussions when we replace completely all the traditional native seeds are gone and we have nothing but GMO? As you say, in the U.S., there hardly much GMO or traditional native plants anyway, but in countries like India and Africa, there are native sources and seeds that are available that are being pushed away by, for example, with BT cotton and other GMO seeds. What are the repercussions to that?
Well, I think that's a problem that we've been dealing with for some time, even before genetically modified seed. Maintaining native seed sources and maintaining biodiversity has been a casualty of the Green Revolution for the most part. So we've been struggling with that for a while. And yes, there are potential repercussions to that. Not only does it create problems for those farmers that you were talking about who may not be able to afford the capital inputs, but whose operations then may become dependent on growing that type of seed because of other things that they're doing that that then are no longer consistent with going back to what they were doing before. But also there's a potential food security issues that can happen if all farmers, even if fully voluntarily and fully by choice, switch over and are successfully for some time growing a certain type or a few different types of seed. If conditions 1 year or for a few successive years are not favorable to those seeds, then of course you can have serious extreme crop failures. And we've already begun to see some significant crop failures relating to GMOs in the United States since around 2010 because of weeds becoming herbicide resistant. So the cotton crop in the United States was badly decimated in 2010, 2011 because of that.
When we talk about GMO foods, right, it's widely controlled by a few corporate entities, and they control the seed. They have a monopoly through and then they collect royalty, and they also create monocultures, right? This is an issue with biodiversity. Is there a government role in ensuring that we have biodiversity even if we go through the GMO corporate controlled aspects of GMO seeds? Is the government washing off its hand on that?
That's a very good question, and not one that I've given a lot of thought to. There are gene banks, seed banks, that are being created with government support, but there may be more that governments can and should be doing there. I think that at least in this country, it would be controversial for the government to be perceived as doing something that discouraged the adoption of genetically modified products, and that shouldn't matter when what you're talking about is an independently valuable goal, such as preserving biodiversity. But politically, I'm certain that there would be a great deal of pushback to the government being very vocal or active about that in this country because of the importance and the importance of the voice of the biotech industry. In countries like India, where there are, number one, more native sources of some of these plants, and a government that has been more skeptical of GMOs, and the lack of a powerful industry voice in favor of it, there might be more ability there to push the issue.
Right, and then I want to speak a little bit about the health issues. There is this concern that GMO food is causing autism prevalence in the U.S. Similarly, you earlier spoke about the use of herbicides that are causing herbicide-resistant weeds. Right. For example, in Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka has banned Roundup, right, which is a known glyphosate herbicide, and because they suspect that it is causing CKD of unknown etiology. And I think there are a couple initiatives like that where Roundup is banned. Even recently, I think yesterday, a news came out where Europe has taken a step back saying we need some more time to rethink giving permission for 15 more years, and Monsanto has been striving hard to get the license for 15 more years. So do you think is there any relation with the health issues cited by certain organizations with GMO food, and also the use of these Roundup type herbicides a lot?
The science on the health impacts is very conflicted.
Okay.
And I say conflicted, and I mean to emphasize that the groups who say that GMOs are safe, period, full stop, are wrong. To say that to say that science is conflicted is not to say that something is safe. But it's also there's not been enough study done to really ascertain what health impacts, if any, there may be. It's very inconclusive so far. So there are some studies that suggest certainly that there might be some potential toxicity from herbicides like Roundup, and particularly for liver and kidney function, toxicity that affects liver and kidney function. There was one fairly well-known study, the Seralini study, that reported that in a long-term, lifelong study on rats. That study was roundly criticized, but the journal that published it and the authors have responded to those criticisms. So it's, I guess, up to everyone to determine in their own judgment whether they feel like there was validity to that study. But certainly that study, even if you think it was professionally done, did not claim to be saying that these herbicides, that by itself, that they're proving that these herbicides cause kidney disease. They did find a link. The authors there emphasized that, in their view, it was the beginning of a study, not the end. And it's been difficult and sort of frustrating as someone who reviews this literature to find good evidence. I think that there are many studies that are backed by the industry itself, and so one has to consider what the motives are in that case. There are studies like the one I just mentioned, the Seralini study, that are highly controversial, and it's difficult in some cases to tell whether that controversy is economically motivated or scientifically motivated. And so it's very difficult to really ascertain right now what the health effects are. A lot of the major professional health societies and professional medical societies have said lately is that they've generally taken a position that there may be effects particularly associated with the use of herbicides. Now, those are secondary effects. Those are not, anything related to the herbicide is not an effect of the genetic modification process itself. It's the effect of modifying them to be resistant to herbicides. The second question, whether the genetic modification process itself changes DNA in ways that has unanticipated effects that may be causing health harms, is even more unclear. There's been quite little study done on that, and there's quite little understood. There's certainly been nothing that proves that it does, but there have been some studies that raise questions. So it's difficult to get at the question of whether there are allergenic effects or toxic effects or endocrine disruption effects from genetic modification itself, and even a little bit difficult to know what the effects are from the use of the herbicides that is associated. So, I think that leaves governments with a choice. They have to decide how precautionary they want to be. with relation to these products. They also have to decide whether they want to be active in promoting research, promoting publicly funded research that will give us better data. I think there is a lack of that right now. I think we have a lack of reliable data. What I don't think is sufficient is for governments to point to those sources that say genetically modified crops and foods have never been proven to cause harms on human health, and so therefore they are safe. Those two things do not follow. First of all, there have been no long-term human studies because these products aren't labeled, so you can't do epidemiological surveys in the United States. There have not been any feeding studies done, food trials done on human beings. There have been some done on animals, but they've been relatively short-term. So the fact that we don't know exactly what the effects are does not mean that they are safe. And so that leaves the governments with this choice then. What do we do in the face of the insufficient data that we have now?
Friends, NRI Samay is a non-profit independent alternate media from Los Angeles, USA, which brings positive stories from grassroots activists from all corners of India and across the world. NRI Samay does not rely on corporate funding, and our shows are commercial free. We only rely on your donations. Corporate-funded media is driven by the TRP rating, and profits are blurring the distinction between news and entertainment. Why do our news channels talk so much about cricket, movies, accidents, popular figures' personal lives, babies of heroines, gossips, etc., while they should be covering the struggles of people, inequality in our society, rural issues, and border security issues? Why did our media raise some corruption crusaders to the sky on one day and shut them off completely when graft charges were raised on those corporate sponsors? Media relies so much on the corporate funding and government blessings that they cannot report independently. NRI Samay is different. We don't accept funds from any corporations, and hence our shows are commercial free. We completely rely on donations from you. Please consider donating to NRI Samay, and please go to nrisamay.com and donate generously. This is the only way together that we can continue NRI Samay. All donations are kept transparent on nrisamay.com. And if you have any questions, please write to nrisamay@gmail.com.
That's interesting about the labeling point you brought up. That takes me to the segue. There is this push to label food with GMO label, right? Is that a welcome initiative? And did that initiative come from the government, or was there a push by individuals or bodies?
Yes, it's very grassroots for the most part. There are certain states in the United States that are more precautionary on this issue, and those state governments have been quite receptive to that. There are now, I think, 5 states that have labeling laws, and that is currently on appeal. The legality of the Vermont law is on appeal right now before a federal court of appeals, and we should hear very soon what that court of appeals says, and that's a case that might go to the U.S. Supreme Court to determine whether states are permitted, consistent with federal law, to require labeling, or whether that's something that's preempted at the federal level. At the federal level, we don't have any kind of labeling law, and there has been some back and forth within Congress about that. There are members of Congress that say the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act preempts labeling and not only does not require it, but preempts the states from passing it. There are other members of Congress who say that the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act needs to be interpreted to require FDA to mandate labels, and there have been members of Congress who have introduced legislation that would say that would indicate that. So far, I don't see anything happening in Congress on that. I think probably the greater push has been toward legislation that would preempt state legislation on that issue, but to some degree that's an economic issue, a desire not to have a patchwork of different rules that would impede trade from state to state. Whether we'll get labeling at the federal level, I don't know. It'll be very interesting to see where the courts go with this Vermont case that's currently pending.
Okay. You mentioned that this was largely a grassroots level initiative to label GMO food. Mm-hmm. And we also spoke earlier where the large population in general is unaware of what GMO food is. Mm-hmm. How do we reconcile these two thoughts, right? So the large population is not aware of what GMO food is, but then there is this grassroots level that came from individuals, I'm assuming. Again, if it's not from individuals coming ask for labeling, where is it coming from?
I think there's a couple of things. I think it's true that the vast majority, well, not the vast majority, a majority of the population is not aware of GMO foods or the fact that they are as prevalent as they are in our food supply. But in those same surveys, they indicate that those people who think they have never eaten genetically modified foods, a majority of them indicate that they would be upset if they went to a restaurant and were served genetically modified foods without being told. So that suggests that even though people are not terribly aware of the existence of these products and how prevalent that they are concerned about it. And I think that the grassroots movement toward labeling is, in my mind, a predictable result of the lack of democratic process that occurred around regulation of these products in the 1980s. If there had been a lengthier and more public debate about these products, about what they were not, and about whether they should be labeled, I think there would not be the same sense of anger and frustration on the part of that percentage of the public that has become aware that these things exist, that they are in well over 90% of the processed food products containing wheat, corn, soybean oil. I think that the labeling movement is an expression of frustration of people who said, "Wait a minute, where were we when this decision was made? Why didn't we hear about this in the 1980s? And now you're telling me that every box of cereal, nearly every box of cereal, and nearly every box of crackers that I have bought in the last 10 years has contained genetically modified foods, and I didn't know that." So I think that there's a lot of anger and frustration about the fact that these decisions were made rather quickly and rather quietly.
Right. I mean, when it comes to food, right? I think humans are very touchy, and they like to know. Mm-hmm. And like you said, in the 80s, this was not that discussed in a democratic manner, right? And you usually do a lot of research and teaching on sustainable agriculture, right? Mm-hmm. So when it comes to democratic process, there are a lot of competing interests, right? One is the development folks, not only in the legislature, but even in general population, there are distinct groups who support one thing over the other. Sometimes they overlap, right? But in general, there are development proponents, then there are environmental concern people, and then the social justice activists. And sometimes they are competing for the attention of their causes. And in one of your articles, greatly, in a philosophical article, I think, on an essay, you discuss Tao and Jung's philosophy, how we can reconcile these differences or work together to bring about a path on providing sustainable agriculture and food, right? Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah. The interesting thing that struck me about Jung's philosophy is that he departed from Sigmund Freud, who thought that conflicts or opposition within the personality had to be resolved in order for a human being to be healthy and functional. Jung thought differently. He thought that that would only lead to oppression of one essential aspect of the personality over another, and that these were, essentially these oppositions were essential aspects of the human personality, and not defects or diseases to be cured. And so, what Jung moved toward, and of course he was a psychologist. He was dealing on the level of the individual personality, which we're not doing here. Right. But his view of the personality was that it was necessary to get away from this idea of the sort of good aspects defeating the bad aspects of the personality, and instead to develop a greater understanding for all the different parts of the personality and the ways that they work together, and to create at least some awareness on the part of the individual patient, in his case, of the parts of the personality that were not conscious, that were not well seen, and for that person to understand that a balance between those parts of the personality was necessary in order to create growth, to sort of be the engine for growth and greater functioning of the human being. And so, in reading about that at the same time that I was studying and teaching about sustainable agriculture, it struck me that might be a much more helpful way for us to think about what our project is here when we're talking about sustainable agriculture, because there have been so many commentators who have said, and often this is a sort of a north versus south sort of split, that there are commentators who say, no, what we need to be most concerned about is development. And as long as people are hungry, as long as people are suffering from lack of electricity and lack of transportation, lack of infrastructure, that needs to be the primary concern, and we really can't be concerned with the environment. And then others say, well, no, we need to be concerned about the environment because, of course, human beings are dependent on it. And then others saying, well, what really matters is how all of these burdens and benefits are divided among the more privileged or the less privileged. And there has been a temptation, I think, to view sustainable development, the concept of sustainable development as a failure, as just sort of greenwashing, or maybe a way for all of us to kind of talk around one another, and that as long as none of these, as long as none of these views is winning, then there's really no value or no solution to sustainable development. And of course, who's to say which one is to win? So in thinking about what Jung was doing on the level of the personality, I think it's interesting to think about applying those concepts on the level of society, and to ask, well, what if instead of saying that we need a principle that tells us, which of these forces is the good one and should win, either in any particular policy decision or writ large, perhaps it would be more useful to sort of analogize to a Jungian model of psychotherapy and say that perhaps what we need is to be aware of the ways in which all of these forces are operating, in ways in which we're often unconscious of and inevitably unconscious of the ways that they're operating, but at least to become conscious that we're unconscious, and to understand these forces as irreconcilable, but also necessary to produce growth. So in my view, it's very, very helpful to hold on to the sort of, the three different pillars of sustainable development, and to insist on the ongoing conflict between them, essentially, in order to move forward in a meaningful way.
Right. One of the things, though, as part of sustainable development and sustainable agriculture is to produce and source locally, right? Is that a right path? Is that a path we are headed? Because we see, I especially see a lot of talk about produce locally and buy locally movement, right? I don't know how widespread it is, but I see that. Is that a path you see taking traction moving forward?
Yes, although I don't know if it's a big part of the solution or if it's a small part of the solution. And the reason I say that is because there are advantages to producing locally in terms of sustainability. It connects people more to the processes that are connected with producing what we consume, and makes them more conscious of consumption and of waste. And in some cases, it is more efficient to produce things locally. But in some cases, it's less efficient to produce things locally. I mean, for example, I live in West Virginia. West Virginia is a mountainous, relatively remote area of the eastern United States, and it is very efficient and productive, or would be, continue, for West Virginia to continue to produce, say, goat meat. Goats can be raised effectively on the type of land that we have here. We could produce more apples. We could produce more vegetables. Certain types of vegetables that grow well in this climate, and those, the trees and the ground crops could be produced at the same time. You could have farms that produce all of these products, farms that are diversified and, therefore preserve the health of the soil and the ecosystem. But it would not be efficient for West Virginia to attempt to produce, a lot of other types of fruits. Vegetables that must be grown in warm climates, large, staple crops like wheat and corn. You can produce those much more efficiently in the Midwest, where there's a lot of flat ground, and you can produce things more efficiently in monocultures. For whatever the downsides are there, you can certainly produce things more efficiently there. So I don't know. I think it's really going to depend case by case. In some cases, you're actually going to consume more fossil fuels trying to produce something locally than you are going to by producing it 500 miles away and shipping it on a train or on a truck. So I don't think that the local movement by itself is going to be a panacea.
Right. That's a good part. On that, though, do you think that the policymakers and law bodies, should they create or implement policies to foster and help promote local production and consumption, or is that something that it just has to be organic?
Well, a lot of it's going to be market-driven. I think a lot of it's going to have to be market-driven. There are things that governments can do and have done in order to provide some incentives. One of the biggest problems that we have in the United States is entry into farming. There are people who would like to get into farming but don't have access to land, and there are things that governments can do in order to try to sort of facilitate transfers and to help to provide sort of preferences for people who would like to get into farming. They can provide incentives for people to shop at farmers markets so they can buy more of their produce locally. And there are things that governments have done to help try to allow people to use SNAP benefits, for example, food aid benefits at farmers markets. So there are things that they can certainly do in order to grease the wheels. And one of the things that may be most important, and this is something that I advise on quite a bit here in West Virginia, is looking at ways that laws and regulations have been developed because of problems that arise from industrial agriculture, which certainly has its risks and costs and unintended consequences. And there are a lot of regulations that have been developed in order to regulate those types of businesses that are costly and really not appropriate for small businesses that are mostly attempting to produce and sell in the local area. And so there's certainly something that people can do on the local level and on the state level, often, sometimes on the federal level, in order to remove or reduce those kinds of barriers to people who would like to meet that market.
I think with that note, we come to an end. So thank you for taking your time today. Thank you very much, Alison.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure to speak to you.
Nice talking to you. Have a nice day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Friends, if you liked today's show, please go to youtube.com/NRI Samay and click on the subscribe button. You will get notified every time we publish a new show. And you can also like us on our social media sites like Facebook, Twitter, and Google+.